Now we move on to the next paper, which is about a cross-country comparison of laws that govern public procurement. And may I request Dia to take over, please?
Yeah, just give me a second. I'll project my screen. Okay, is my screen visible and am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Bhargavi, and good morning, everyone. So today I'll be presenting the work we have done in our paper titled The Role of the Legal Framework in Public Procurement, Evidence from a Cross-Country Comparison. I'll begin by setting the context for this work. I'll then talk about the questions we explore in the paper, the approach we take in this study, and I'll end with some of the key takeaways that we have so far. Okay, now public procurement transactions, as we know, are essentially commercial transactions with the government as a counterparty. And in most jurisdictions, we see that there is a specific legal framework that governs these public procurement transactions and dictates how they must be done. Now, in the literature that evaluates these legal frameworks, we often see that this evaluation is done based on their fulfillment of some identified objectives. Okay, so for instance, the World Bank in 2017 released a report called the Benchmarking Public Procurement Report, where they scored the legal frameworks in countries on a scale of 0 to 100 based on their fulfillment of some identified objectives. And these objectives have gone on to become what are known as core principles, which are thought necessary to underlie all public procurement transactions. So, what are these objectives? Now, in the literature, we are seeing that there are suggestions that these objectives should be elements like competition, efficiency, transparency, accountability, fair treatment, and so on. And in theory, these objectives may be compatible and may coexist. However, in reality, there are often trade-offs that are required to be made between these often competing objectives, and governments are often forced to prioritize or choose one over the other. So, for example, in a bid to push transparency, a government may introduce prescriptive rules which reduce discretion but also reduce the efficiency of the transaction. And here they are therefore prioritizing transparency over efficiency. Similarly, a government with a strong local preference policy may have to compromise on some element of competition. And as of now, there is no objective way in which the value of each of these objectives can be measured to dictate to us which should be prioritized over the other. And because of this, in our paper, we take the view that examining a legal framework from the perspective of the objectives that it seeks to fulfill is not necessarily a good starting point if we don't understand why these objectives are important in the first place. And therefore, in our paper, we attempt to answer three main questions. The first question is what is the role of the legal framework in public procurement transactions? And for this, we examine what makes these transactions different from other commercial transactions. And we also attempt to identify some problems that the legal framework has to contend with and attempt to solve for. The second question that we seek to examine are what are the tools of regulation in public procurement legislative frameworks? And thirdly, how does the Indian legal framework for public procurement compare with the provisions we are seeing in other countries? So for this study, we take a first principles approach where we review the legal frameworks in other countries, firstly to identify some problems that these frameworks attempt to solve, and also secondly to identify how they try to solve it by looking for the tools that they use to regulate these transactions. And we do this analysis in three main jurisdictions, the US, UK, and EU. And in each of these cases in our paper, we set out the broad contours of the law, that is the structure of the framework, as well as go deeper into the key provisions that comprise this framework. And we also look at the nature of these provisions as well. And having done this, we then attempt to identify the gaps in the Indian legal framework when we compare it with these other legal frameworks. So what you see before you is essentially a reviewing matrix that we formulated, which we use as a lens to review the legal frameworks in the three jurisdictions that I just pointed out. So what we do here is essentially divide all the processes in public procurement across three broad stages. So in the first stage, we have what we call the pre-award to award stage. And in this, we include processes like procurement planning, tendering, bidding, and so on. In the second stage, we have the award to completion. And the processes that comprise the second stage are the execution of the contract, making of an initial payment, if at all, contract monitoring, and so on. And the last stage is the completion to payment stage, where the project is completed and there is final payment made for the services rendered. Now, in each of these stages, we also include the element of dispute settlement, because a dispute might arise at any point in time during the procurement process. Okay, so what did we learn from this exercise? Now, we were able to identify some unique elements in public procurement transactions that set them apart from other transactions. So the first unique element we were able to identify is that in public procurement transactions, there is a large scale use of public funds for what is essentially a commercial transaction. And this potentially gives rise to a principal agent problem. Now, a principal agent problem is a fairly well understood problem in economics and might exist not only in public procurement transactions, but even in transactions or in private organizations. However, we believe that in public procurement, there is an exacerbated form of this problem for many reasons. First is, of course, the use of public funds, the scale of the use of public funds, and also the fact that perhaps accountability mechanisms in a public procurement situation will be less direct than those available in a private organization. And therefore, the question for regulation is then how can regulation ensure that an agent acts in the best interest of the principal when using public funds in public procurement? A second unique element that we identify is, of course, that the government is a contracting party. Now, this gives rise to two potential problems. The first is that the government, being a powerful party, is at an inherent advantage in these transactions, and this leads to what we call an imbalance of power problem. And this arises out of two main situations. The first is that in these transactions, the government is not only a contracting party, but also a rule maker. So it has the ability to set bind its own behavior as well as the behavior of its counterparty, and also set the rules of the game. Okay, and the second reason why there's perhaps an imbalance of power is because the government has access to a larger amount of resources than a private party does, and therefore is perhaps better able to pursue things such as litigation during the process. Now, in all transactions, we see an imbalance, a potential imbalance of power between two parties, but we believe that in public procurement transactions, there is an exacerbated form of the problem. And therefore, the question for regulation is then, how can regulation address this imbalance? A second potential problem that arises out of the government being a party is that unlike a private organization, which is driven by profit making and is therefore incentivized to be productive and efficient, a government is not necessarily guided by commercial incentives and may instead choose to follow policy objectives such as local preference policies, a domestic preference, and so on. And therefore, the question for regulation is then, how can regulation ensure that the government acts in a commercial manner? So in our review of the legal frameworks in the jurisdictions that I pointed out, what we attempted to do is map the objectives of those laws with some of the unique elements and problems that we had previously identified. And we see that, for example, the principal agent problem is attempted to be addressed by pursuing objectives of transparency and accountability. And here I've also listed some of the tools used for regulation in these countries. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, it's just a set of examples to give you a flavor of the kind of tools that we are seeing in each of these cases. So for transparency, we are seeing that most legal frameworks have very detailed tendering rules set out, and these rules dictate the process to be followed during tendering, the manner of publication, the contents of the tender document, and so on. And what this essentially seeks to do is limit the discretion of the procurement entity and set out rules that must be followed to the T. Another tool we see is the requirement of extensive reporting. So, for example, in the UK, we see that individual reports have to accompany every awarded contract, and the law even sets out what these reports are to have. They're supposed to have details such as any conflict of interest, reasons for the bid award, the duration of the bid, and so on. And not only are the contents of the report specified, there is also mechanisms or structures in place for multiple levels of reporting set out in the law itself. And even in terms of record keeping, we see that there is extensive requirement for record keeping even beyond the period of the contract. So for example, again, in the UK, we see that the minimum time for which records have to be preserved are 3 years from the date of award. So there is some kind of archiving of data that's possible. Another
you have about 2 minutes more.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
You have about 3 minutes more.
Okay. Another tool that we are seeing is the designation of persons under these for carrying out specified processes in the procurement process, which seeks to assign responsibility under the statute itself to a specialized cadre of people. So we also see that the imbalance of power problem is addressed in these legal frameworks. There are separate laws that determine how that payment needs to be made. They also dictate that special redressal forums be formed to ensure that redressal is cost effective and timely. Again, we see that tools of regulation such as the requirement of an open tender process is as a norm as opposed to a limited tender process is something that is put into place to ensure that the government acts in a commercial manner for competition. So what we did here is that we compared the GFR, which is the principal instrument that governs procurement in India, to what we are seeing in other jurisdictions.
Dia, your voice is not coming through. It might be useful to switch off the video. That will improve the bandwidth.
My video is off. Can you confirm if my voice is coming through now?
Yeah, I can hear her quite well.
Okay. Thanks. So what we've done here is essentially set out, do a comparison between the GFR and what we're seeing in other countries. And while we find that in India, many of the tools are similar, we see some gaps in the provisions in terms of record keeping. We also see that there are no detailed rules on planning. And we don't have a separate dispute resolution forum. There are also no provisions in the GFR for payment delays. So while we see that there is a key focus in legal frameworks for the principal agent problem and imbalance of power problem, we also see that there are differences in the tools used to address these problems. In India, we see the approach appears to be to limit the discretion of the procuring entity. However, we have a limited toolkit for accountability provisions. In India, we see a gap in managing the imbalance of power problem, and this is where we perhaps see the most room for improvement. Now, having determined what the role of the legal framework should be, it is still important to keep some considerations in mind while designing the legal framework. The first is that we understand that better laws may not necessarily result in better outcomes, and we see this in the literature. And Shubho and I had also done a small case study which was published as a blog to essentially show this as well. It's also unclear to us how to gauge the value of competing objectives, and because there is no objective way in which we can measure which should be prioritized over the other. And lastly, prescriptive rules may be necessary to limit discretion. However, they also increase costs, and it's important to understand how to judge when these rules become burdensome. And right now, there's no objective way in doing so. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and suggestions.
Thanks, Dia. So we have Ms. Sudha Krishnan here, who will discuss and critique this paper. As again, as many of you all are aware, Ms. Krishnan has worked with the government for more than about 30 years. During her time at the government, she's also been associated with the expenditure department, which is sort of the nodal agency for sanctioning a lot of public procurement projects. She's been a huge support to our work. We often, may I use the word, if we often bother her with queries on, whether what we are thinking is on the right lines, and she's been a really good support in terms of getting us feedback on the way this work is proceeding. Ms. Krishnan, if I may just request you to turn on the video and take over. Thank you. Ms. Krishnan, are you there? Can you hear us? You're on mute. You'll have to if you could just unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank Dia and Anjali, who I think is also a co-author of this paper, for putting together a very well-researched paper and analyzing the provisions in so many acts and regulations in different countries and trying to plow through the very confusing system that we have in India of GFR and various other rules and regulations. It's a very well-researched paper indeed. I have a few comments to make, and my comments will essentially be on the GFR, on the history of the procurement laws in India, and some comments on some of the recommendations that are there that the paper has made. And I'd sort of request all of you to bear with me, because I come in from the point of view of a practitioner, and I'm not really a researcher or an academic, so do bear with me while I go through my points. The GFR is the government the general financial rules of the government. It's a sort of a broad set of guiding principles, essentially, for government procurements. And the major procuring departments of the central government, certainly, and many state governments also, have developed their own detailed manuals and procedures over a period of time. And some of these manuals and procedures are very old and have been used for decades. By and large, most of the procedures you will find are in line with the general provisions that exist in the GFR. If I could use an example, Dia, you have made a reference to the EU, where you've said that the EU itself comes up with sort of minimum standards, which then different countries in the EU augment by their own detailed manuals and procedures. So the GFR and I think the manuals that different major departments of government use have to be seen in that light. The minimum standards are set by the GFR, and then different departments have their own very detailed procedures, in fact, extremely detailed procedures in place, which they have developed to suit their own needs. So what's happened in India is therefore that you have this plethora of rules and procedures that have been developed by different departments, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Railways, the Department of Space, Department of Atomic Energy, the major procuring entities, national highways, major procuring entities of the government have their own detailed procedures. So when the procurement law, or rather the public procurement bill as it's probably exists today, when the discussions on that started happening in about 2012, it was found to be rather difficult to put in place a regulation that could cover all the nuances and flavors that had developed over time in the user departments. In fact, I'm sure many of you would remember that there was a V.K. Dhal committee report in 2011, which started this entire debate about the need for a procurement law in India. And V.K. Dhal committee report basically went into the issue of public procurement. And the committee report is sort of famous or infamous, if I may use that word, in that the majority of the members dissented from the report. And in fact, if you look at the report, it's really strange. There is a report of a committee, and then there are several dissent notes, and then there are dissent notes on the dissent notes. So it just tells you that this whole thing, different people have very strong views about the way in which procurement should be done. So when we started discussions on the Public Procurement Act, it was realized that that we ran two risks. One risk was that you would have clauses in the act or in the draft, which would in a way hinder the hands or encumber the user departments who had already developed certain procedures over time that were fine for their requirements. And so, for the sake of uniformity, we would end up with taking away flexibility from some people. And the other option was that if you tried to make the clauses completely uniform so that it kind of suited everybody in a very, very generic way, then it just became too plain vanilla. I mean, it was too bland, and it wasn't really an improvement over the GFR. But despite all this, the Department of Expenditure did struggle through with various rounds of deliberations with user departments and did come up with a public procurement bill, which has probably not been enacted for exactly the same reasons that I just discussed, that people don't really know whether there is any value addition over the GFR because of the problems that I just mentioned. This was something, these are really two comments that I have from the generic point of view. I mean, I could always add or reply to any questions or any suggestions later on. I have a couple of comments to make on some of the recommendations that have been made in the paper. There are some recommendations or suggestions for improvement to the public procurement process, basically saying that procurement planning should be improved and that we should have special redressal forums. There should be penalty for late payments, etc. On the issue of procurement planning, Shubho has touched on this in his presentation, which we all just heard with a lot of interest. There is a serious problem about lack of planning, lack of adequate planning before government decides to go in for a procurement. And it is very important that we should be planning better. We should have a better understanding of what exactly we want to procure, when we want to procure it, how we want to procure it. Some of the successful cases in procurement that you find in the government are where these things are taken into account at an early stage. When I was in the Expenditure Management Commission, we did make some recommendations to say that a government should keep aside some amount of money, should make available some amount of money to government departments for doing what is called a good DPR, or a detailed project report, before they actually plunge into the business of procurements. And we did also suggest that time schedules for critical decisions, such as, when will I float, by when will I analyze the bids that have come in, by when will I take a decision on the award of contract, or when will I be in a position to say, give you the land or give you the final drawings, etc. That these time schedules should be listed out in the bid document and or in the contract document, as the case may be, so that there is some sort of a binding on government in terms of the groundwork that it needs to do before it enters into a procurement. On the issue of having special redressal forum, I'm not entirely sure about this. Maybe I can ask somebody like Shubho, what has been the experience of other special redressal forums or tribunals, as we know them in India, whether these tribunals have in fact proved to be more efficient or effective or faster ways of dealing with dispute, sort of dispute redressal mechanisms. I don't really have data on this. I'm not very sure whether a special redressal forum to take care of disputes and contracts would really be very effective. And I'm happy to discuss this a little further and think about what is the best way to do it. At the moment, of course, as Dia points out, we essentially have arbitration and courts, which is where everybody goes for dispute redressal. And while it is correct to say that there is an imbalance of power and that the government tends to hold the upper hand in procurements, I don't know, again, we need to do some analysis on this. I suspect that a lot of the litigation is started not by government, but by the contractors or the vendors. And of course, government is, kind of has to respond and perhaps take it to higher courts if they feel that there is a need to do that. And I also don't know how many court decisions or arbitration decisions go in favor of government as opposed to in favor of the contractor. It would be interesting to see that, to understand what exactly is happening in the dispute redressal mechanism right now. On the issue of payments, I completely agree that delay in payments is a very major issue in procurements and in contracting. And I think you have a separate session on this a little later in the day. What perhaps we need to understand a little bit more, if we can do it through research, is where exactly is the delay happening, or rather, which is the most significant contributor to the delay? Is it government procedures, by which I mean the administrative hierarchy, that a bill has to pass through X number of hands before it gets cleared, or that it needs X number of things to be ticked off before the payment is finally made? Is that the main problem? Or is it that there are contractual requirements that lead to delays in payments? Like, for instance, in roads projects, for instance, there may be very often a question of measurements that have to be done before the payment is finally made. So it could be that the process of measurements gets delayed because maybe government doesn't have adequate staff, or there could be some other problem why we're not able to do the measurements fast enough. Or it could be that the payment is linked to some particular performance requirement in the contract. For instance, on scientific side, very often equipment gets delivered, but the final payment will get released only after the equipment has functioned to the satisfaction of the client for X period. So that could be one reason why payments get delayed, also because of contractual clauses. Of course, another reason why payments do get delayed, quite apart from what one may hear about corruption, which Shubho has already talked about and said that perhaps that's not such a major issue. But one reason, in my experience, why payments get delayed is because we sometimes don't have predictability of resources or adequate budget. Sometimes, for instance, government has cash management problems. There are fiscal deficit targets that have to be met. So you may find that your budget is either reduced, or you may find that you have spending constraints that are introduced from time to time. And obviously, then you can't really pay your vendors and your contractors in the manner in which you should. So I think this is perhaps an area that we need to look at a little bit more. Why is it that we have such a problem of payments in India to contractors and vendors? Again, in the EMC, the Expenditure Management Commission, we had suggested a sort of a possible way to take care of this. We had recommended that perhaps a specified percentage of the bill should be paid within a week, and then other checks and balances could follow to enable full payment, so that the contractor at least has some amount upfront and there is a certainty to that, and the rest of the payment could be released later as and when it was possible to do it. I'm not, Dia, I'm not very clear on what is meant by reporting, not, that there's not enough reporting in government or not enough record keeping in government procurement. There was a table that you had showed, which is table 6 of your paper, if I remember right, where this has been, there's an X mark against these 2 items. On reporting, I thought, my understanding is that we already have several layers of reporting in government. Do you think that we need to add to these layers, or is it your view that there should be one single entity in government to whom reports are sent on the way in which contracts are being run or administered? I'm not very sure whether that would be a practical way of looking at it, given the complexity and the sheer volume of contracts that governments enter into. On the record keeping part of it, I would just like to tell you that we do have I think very exhaustive record keeping in all procurements that government undertakes, basically because of the accountability issues involved. And everybody knows, as you've already said in your paper, that the CBC and the CAG, etc., are all there as oversight mechanisms. So there is very detailed record keeping. In fact, it's probably far too detailed. Maybe it's not, the rules are not there in the GFR, but every department does keep very detailed records of how it has handled a particular procurement case. I do agree with the summing up that is there in your paper. I thought you've put it very well, that the problem is perhaps more in terms of implementation of individual contracts, or implementation in terms of how government goes about procurement, the poor planning, etc., and state capacity. It's probably these are the main reasons why we have inefficiencies in our procurement and contracting system. Bhargavi, that's all I have to say in terms of comments. I'm not sure where I am on time, but I think I'm through.
No, this was great. So actually, you're late by all of 3 minutes, but I just didn't feel like stopping the discussion. There was just so much rich information coming out of it. So, and in any case, we had planned a break, and I guess we can skip the break right now. So I just want to quickly respond to a couple of things Ms. Krishnan said, and then Dia can take over. And, on the dispute resolution question, you're indeed right? We do not know to what extent the multiple dispute resolution mechanisms are working. And the next paper actually talks about whether the extent to which governments and businesses use courts for dispute resolution. And if you could stay on for that, then, it's some really nice early quantitative evidence on how much of public procurement disputes really go through courts. So with that, Dia, if you could just address the comments Ms. Krishnan had, and if anybody has questions from the audience, yes, we do see some questions in the chat box itself. So Dia, all yours. I think you have about good 7-8 minutes, and if you can use those to respond. Thanks.
Thanks, Bhargavi. Firstly, thank you very much for your comments, Ms. Krishnan. I think I know personally it's extremely valuable to have comments from a practitioner, because in doing the paper, I think it's very easy to get carried away with the theoretical underpinnings of the law and all of the frameworks, and it's just great to have that perspective. Having said that, when we began the paper, the idea came up because everywhere whenever we researched about why public procurement had problems, there seemed to be constant suggestions that we need a uniform law. The law seems to be a problem. There is fragmentation of provisions and so on. And one of the motivations for us to do this study was to actually understand whether this is actually the case, and how different really are we from what other countries are doing. And surprisingly, we one of the things that we figured was that other legal frameworks are fragmented as well. And so fragmentation in terms of saying that the provisions are spread across here and there doesn't seem to be something that is only unique to India. And therefore in the paper, I think we make a conscious effort to stop short of saying that we need a uniform law in public procurement. Rather, what we do instead is try to identify some elements where the existing laws can perhaps be fortified and improved. As far as, so that is basically to your comment on what is the value addition of having a separate law or a specific law over the GFR. I guess the suggestion is not to have a uniform separate law as is being campaigned for by many quarters, but is to see in what way the existing provisions of the GFR perhaps can be strengthened to at least ensure that the design of the system is well placed. I will not. So the questions on the redressal forum and the penalty for late payments, I think Bhargavi's addressed some on the redressal forum, and there'll be a presentation on disputes coming up. So I'll skip over those. However, on the reporting and record keeping question that you had was, basically, do we really need it, and is it an oversimplification? So on a plain reading of the law itself, it's a bit difficult for us to identify what these report keeping and record keeping requirements under the law that are imposed on the government are. These may be internal procedures that are being done by departments themselves, but the law itself doesn't set out, say, the requirements for reporting, or even talk about what elements of the transactions have to be reported. And therefore you may have a situation where in some departments reporting is being done more exhaustively and in a more holistic way than, say, in other departments. And perhaps there is some value in thinking about setting a minimum standard, again, like we're seeing in other countries, for these reporting requirements, and anything done over and above that is fine. In terms of record keeping, I think one of the key things that we thought about was also the fact that archiving of data, I think, is something that we're seeing, at least availability in the public domain is not there, and therefore perhaps that's one more thing to think about. Whereas where record keeping is happening, but there's not much of it being set out or released in the public domain as well. So I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much again for your comments. We'll definitely incorporate them in our future work on this paper.
Thanks, Dia. So a couple of questions from the audience. They're right there in the chat box, but I'll just quickly summarize them. The first one is that, is it possible, or is there any literature out there which actually summarizes the procedural differences amongst states in their procurement processes? For instance, Andhra Pradesh earlier allowed Swiss challenge, which raised many questions, but given that a lot of internal procedures in government are driven by precedent, how difficult is it to introduce a reform in public procurement laws? So I think I would take that separately from the interstate comparison question. Something to think about, I think. And are there some jurisdictions where past performance of bidders is considered beyond just the factor of blacklisting? So I guess I'm not too sure to what extent the law answers these questions, as opposed to internal procedures and practices, which I think Ms. Krishnan is also referring to, to what extent those internal procedures answer these questions. So Dia, if you come across any literature that answers these questions, that would be helpful.
Yeah. So, on the first question of whether there are studies or some sort of benchmarking on the interstate differences in India. So it says in India or elsewhere. So I will just answer the question for India first. So the structure of laws in India is that some states do have some laws that they've enacted for specifically for public procurement. For example, Tamil Nadu has a Transparency in Tenders Act. Karnataka has one as well. But for the large part, states themselves have their own, from what we understand, rules in the nature of the GFR, which are largely, which largely coincide with what we're seeing in the GFR. Now, we've not come across any literature that actually sets out to benchmark, interstate differences in procurement, general procurement. However, there have been studies, for example, which look at specific types of procurement. So, for example, in health procurement, you will see that there is some kind of benchmarking done across states, comparing Maharashtra, say, for example, which follows a different model of procurement, say from Tamil Nadu or Karnataka and Kerala and so on. So there is some literature, but it's specific to specific types of procurement. In other jurisdictions, whether there are interstate differences, there's literature on interstate differences, I'm not aware of that. But I can't understand whether this means across countries or within each country. So I'll assume that this is within countries. So, and I'm not aware of that. As far as the second question goes, which says that are there some jurisdictions where past performers of bidders are considered beyond just the factor of blacklisting? If I remember right, there are provisions in the law in the US again, which do cancel out, automatically cancel out bidders that have, say, for example, engaged in some kind of fraudulent behavior and so on. But that's just as far as my knowledge goes. I hope that answers the questions, and I hope I've understood them correctly.
Okay. So thanks, Diya. Thanks, Ms. Krishnan. Now,